Good evening, my friends. Gather round for tonight, on this brisk December night as the holy holiday draws near. I welcome you to a very special Christmas presentation. Here, nestled in a cozy cottage, the snow falling softly outside, a warm fire crackling at the hearth, I have 5 Christmas tales of a different kind for you. I'm Mason, your host, and you're watching Char TV. Christmas is a season of joy, of giving, of light shining in the darkness. But tonight, we're delving through the shadows that linger just beyond the glow of the holiday lights. These are stories of wonder, fear, and mystery, laced with the haunting magic of the season. One tale speaks of goblins, wicked and restless, who rise during the 12 days of Christmas to spread their mischief. Another whispers a familiar Christmas story of greed, yet this time it twists and turns into something far more sinister. One warns of the dreaded percha, a spirit who stalks the idle and punishes the careless on the coldest of nights. And another brings us to a cursed manor, where Christmas Eve becomes a night steeped in shadows and unspeakable dread. And finally, my favorite story of the evening, an encounter with something extraordinary, something divine in the quiet stillness of a snowy parking lot. It's a tale of faith rekindled and the wonder of the season reborn. Before we begin, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to Char TV, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story. Tonight, let's embrace the magic, the mystery, and even the haunting chill of the Christmas season. Shall we begin? It's a frigid December night on the outskirts of a small Greek village, right near the rugged foothills leading to ancient forests. There's a bonfire crackling in the center of a clearing. The men huddle close to the flames, passing around cups of warm tea spiced with cinnamon, while the women and children gather in blankets, eyes reflecting the flicker of the firelight. Everyone's listening with rapt attention. Winter nights in these parts are known for their deep silences, except for the stories people share when the wind starts to whistle through the pines. Sometimes these stories are joyous, but other times, around the 12 days of Christmas, the stories lean toward the ominous. Tonight, the elders speak of the Kalikantzaroi, a band of malevolent goblins said to rise from the underworld during the holiday season. They appear when the veil between realms is thin, the night air chilled by midwinter's breath. For many, the Kalikantzaroi are silly old folklore, trickster spirits that cause petty mischief. But as old grandfather Kyrillos leans forward into the glow of the flames, his voice turns grim. He begins a story from his childhood that he swears is true. He was just a boy then, maybe 11 or 12, living in a one-room stone cottage on the edge of the village. His family herded goats, eking out a humble living among rocky hills. The nights were long, but Christmas was near, so everyone was excited. People spoke of feasts and midnight mass, but they also spoke in hushed tones about the Kalikantzaroi, how they'd creep out from the bowels of the earth during the 12 days from Christmas to Epiphany. According to legend, the Kalikantzaroi spend the rest of the year beneath the earth, soaring at the trunk of the great world tree. If that trunk ever gives way, the entire world collapses. But come the sacred days of Christmas, they leave their endless soaring and scurry above ground to wreak mischief. And the family always made sure to hang crosses by the doors and smear the threshold with garlic to keep the fiends at bay. One evening, just after dusk, young Kyrillos was sent out to gather wood. A dusting of snow covered the ground, glittering faintly beneath the slim slice of moon. His breath plumed in front of him as he trudged around the back of the cottage. A sharp wind whistled in the trees. He knelt, picking up dry logs from the woodpile, but paused when he heard shuffling footsteps behind him. It could have been just a stray dog, or maybe a goat that broke loose. But he heard a faint chittering, something that sounded almost like muffled laughter. He turned around and saw a small shape scuttling by the corner of the cottage. It darted behind a broken barrel and peered out with wide, bulging eyes. Kyrillos froze. Whatever he was looking at was no dog. The creature was maybe half his height, its skin dark and leathery, with thin limbs and a disproportionately large head. Its eyes glowed faintly red in the moonlight. For a second, Kyrillos thought it might be a child, dressed up in some ragged costume, but then it bared a mouthful of tiny crooked teeth and hissed at him. A chill far colder than the winter air ran down his spine. He knew the stories. Could it be a Kalikantzaroi? He had assumed they were just tales to keep children from wandering at night. Yet here was living proof, crouched under the broken barrel, sniffing the air like a rat sniffing cheese. Kyrillos backed away slowly, never breaking eye contact. Fear churned in his gut, but curiosity tugged at him. The creature cocked its head, gave a crooked grin, then skittered off into the darkness around the cottage. Kyrillos dropped the logs and ran inside, shouting about some demon outside. His parents tried to calm him, telling him it was just a trick of the moonlight, maybe a stray cat or a dream. But the goosebumps on his arms wouldn't subside. He knew what he saw. Over the next few nights, strange happenings plagued the cottage. Doors left bolted at bedtime were found wide open come dawn. Milk that had been set on the table vanished by morning, replaced by muddy footprints on the floor. The goats bleated in alarm during the late hours, as if teased or tormented by tiny, invisible hands. Then came Christmas Eve. A bitter wind blew relentlessly, and the snow piled up in swirling drifts. The family gathered around the hearth, trying to keep warm. Kyrillos' father had placed extra garlic above the door, along with an icon of the Nativity, hoping to ward off evil spirits. The mother prayed in the corner, fingers flicking over her rosary beads. Kyrillos couldn't shake the feeling that something watched them through the windows that night, pressing against the frosted panes. Whenever he dared look, he caught fleeting shapes skulking just beyond the flicker of the firelight. Around midnight, the wind died abruptly. The silence was so intense you could hear the wax dripping from the candles. Kyrillos' father tensed. This sudden stillness felt unnatural. A hush before the storm. A noise like soft scratching drifted through the walls. The mother's eyes widened. She clutched her rosary tighter. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It came from above, on the roof. Kyrillos' father rushed outside with a lantern to see if the swirling snow had dislodged some tiles. The moment he opened the door, the storm howled back to life, gusts swirling, nearly blowing out the lantern flame. And that's when the father saw them. Half a dozen small figures perched on the roof, black silhouettes against the cloudy sky. Their limbs clung to the edges with unnatural ease. When the lantern light hit them, their eyes reflected a dull, red glow. They scattered like roaches, squealing as they vanished behind the chimney. The father stumbled backward, heart in his throat, shouting for the family to stay inside. He slammed the door shut and bolted it. Inside, Kyrillos clung to his mother. The shadows danced across the walls as the candles flickered. Suddenly, a thunderous crash rattled the shutters. Something outside was banging on the wooden walls. Another crash, even louder, forced the father to brace the door with his shoulder. A chorus of high-pitched cackles erupted outside. It sounded like children laughing, except pitched unnervingly high, with a twisted glee that set every nerve on edge. The father and mother prayed in frantic whispers. Kyrillos felt tears burning in his eyes. A putrid smell like rotting eggs seeped through the cracks in the walls. It was as though these goblins exuded a tangible aura of decay. Moments passed in heart-pounding terror. Then, as if they tired of toying with the family, the pounding ceased. The cackles moved away from the cottage, swirling off into the distant night. The wind died down again. A dreadful calm returned. The family crept outside, lantern in hand, bracing for what they might find. The moon peeked through ragged clouds, revealing a chaotic mess. Footprints, tiny clawed footprints, circled the cottage again and again, stamped into the snow. Some even crawled up the walls to the roof's edge. Chunks of straw from the thatched roof lay scattered, as though gnawed or torn apart, but the little horrors were gone. For the rest of the 12 days, the family remained on high alert. They sprinkled holy water around the cottage every night, burned incense and lit extra candles. They stopped leaving even the smallest window unlatched. While they still heard distant giggles at odd hours, the goblins never again mustered such a direct assault on the cottage. Finally, come Epiphany, the legends say the Kalikantzaroi return underground to continue their endless soaring of the world tree's trunk. They vanish as if they never existed at all, until next Christmas, when the 12 nights begin anew. Years later, Kyrillos says that memory still haunts him. He can't forget the red glow in those eyes, the scurrying steps along the roof, the smell of something foul in the cold winter wind. Even as a grown man, with a family of his own, every Christmas season he lines his doorways with garlic, keeps an icon of Christ high on the mantle, and leaves small bowls of salt around the house. He claims it's a precaution, just a holdover from old Greek superstition, but there's a tremor in his voice whenever he talks about that night. Some folks snicker at the idea of goblins roaming on the holy days of Christmas, but in the rural villages and in the hush of midwinter nights, old beliefs die hard. Superstition mixes with caution. People say the line between this world and the underworld thins when we celebrate the birth of light in the darkest time of year. The Kalikantzaroi might not be as well known as Krampus or other dark holiday figures, but to those who've glimpsed them, they're far more than a story. They're a warning of the things that lurk just out of sight, mischievous, chaotic forces set loose by the shifting of the seasons. So whenever you spend Christmas in an old Greek village, huddled by a lonely hearth, you might hear cackling on the wind. You might see claw-like tracks in the snow, or find your door suddenly ajar in the morning. If you do, just remember, the Kalikantzaroi wander freely until Epiphany dawns. Keep your garlic, your crosses, and your prayers at hand, because the 12 days of Christmas aren't only about joy and giving. They can also be about warding off the darkest mischief in the cold and timeless night. New York City was swallowed in an unforgiving storm that Christmas Eve, the thick drifts of snowfall piling like frosty barricades along Fifth Avenue. The frigid air stung the faces of the few who still prowled the streets, but most had already holed up inside, warm beneath blankets or next to fireplaces, celebrating the holiday with their families. Yet, for all the glitter of Manhattan's famous window displays and tree-lined avenues twinkling with decorations, one man high above in his corner office felt no trace of festive cheer. His name was Jack Luxmore. He was the kind of Wall Street titan other moguls envied and employees feared. His ruthless methods had built him a private empire, dominating the skyline at 33 floors of polished steel and mirrored glass. While the rest of the city exhaled for the holidays, Jack had stayed behind in his silent office, finalizing a year-end property acquisition that would evict dozens of struggling families in a Brooklyn neighborhood. The storm might rage outside, but inside, he reveled in the glow of his computer monitor and the satisfaction of another lucrative deal. In the corner of his spacious office, a flat-screen TV played an old black-and-white adaptation of A Christmas Carol. The volume was low, just a faint murmur of ghostly visits and hopeful carols. Jack barely noticed it at first, too absorbed in spreadsheets and contracts. But as he glanced up, the film showed Ebenezer Scrooge trembling before Marley's chains. Jack sneered. He grabbed the remote from his desk and switched off the TV with a casual flick of his thumb. The screen went dark, snuffing out any notion that ghosts might come to deliver moral lessons to men like him. He was content in his cynicism. Compassion was weakness, success demanded focusing on the bottom line, and it was nearly midnight, a perfect time to seal the deal. As he checked the final contract signature, a smirk curled his lips. "Merry Christmas to me," he muttered under his breath. The building was eerily still when he stepped into the hallway. Offices that had hummed with activity just days prior now lay dark and empty. Every step he took echoed against tiled floors and tinted windows. Riding the private elevator down, he saw only his reflection in the mirrored walls, tall, wiry build, slicked back hair, an expensive coat draped over an expensive suit. No sign of remorse in those cold eyes, just self-satisfaction. Halfway to the lobby, the elevator lurched. The lights flickered, dropping him into sudden blackness. His heart hammered as the carriage ground to a halt between floors. For an agonizing few seconds, nothing stirred. Then came a sound like fingernails scraping overhead, a slow, deliberate noise that traveled across the metal roof of the elevator. Jack swallowed his panic. "Hello?" He snapped at the darkness. Silence. He clenched his fists, mentally cursing the building's maintenance crew. Perhaps the storm was messing with power lines. Then, just as suddenly, the overhead lights sputtered back to life and the elevator lurched downward. The door slid open smoothly in the lobby, revealing its cavernous expanse lit by the glow of a security desk lamp. Jack released a pent-up breath, though his pulse still raced. Glancing at his watch, he convinced himself the incident was just a glitch from the blizzard. Nothing more. Outside, the gale battered the glass facade, throwing snow in stinging gusts. His chauffeur was waiting at the curb, a black limousine idling with exhaust pluming into the night. Jack hustled through the wind, nearly slipping on the icy sidewalk. The moment he slid into the back seat, he barked at the driver. "Penthouse! Now!" They glided through the empty streets, just splashes of neon and swirling flakes in the windows. The radio hissed with static. Jack tried flicking to a news station, but the only answer was white noise. Something in the static pricked the hairs on the back of his neck. Was there a voice whispering his name in the distortion? Irritated, he snapped the radio off. For a moment he watched the city roll past. Dark storefronts, holiday lights half buried in snowdrifts. Everyone had gone home to celebrate. Only Jack pressed on, alone. Soon enough they arrived at his luxury high-rise, a gleaming monolith of mirrored panels. He left the chauffeur behind and stepped into the marble lobby, unoccupied except for a lone doorman station. The doorman too had taken off for Christmas. The hush of the place made the hair on his arm stand up again. Something about this night unsettled him, though he refused to admit it was fear. His private elevator ride to the penthouse was uneventful this time, depositing him in the sleek, open-concept living space he called home. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the exterior walls, unveiling the metropolis below, a galaxy of street lamps and snow-swirled darkness. The penthouse interior was all modern minimalism. Black marble floors, sparse designer furniture, not a single holiday decoration in sight. Jack never bothered with the fuss of Christmas trees or wreaths. He shrugged out of his coat, noticing how unexpectedly cold it felt, even though the thermostat read 72. "Damned heating system," he muttered. The dryness in his throat made him crave a drink. But as he headed for the bar, a scraping sound echoed along the hallway to his left. It was a low drag of metal on marble. He froze. For a moment he wondered if maintenance was in the penthouse, though how they'd entered without his knowledge was anyone's guess. "Who's there?" His voice echoed in the lofted ceilings. No response. Mustering courage, he advanced into the hallway, turning on every light switch he could find. Shadows danced across the polished marble. The scraping came again, this time from near the living room. He pivoted around. The overhead lights flickered. A shape formed in the middle of the floor. Ragged, twisted, with long, dragging chains. Jack's heart lurched painfully. The figure was faint, nearly transparent, but he could see tatters of a once expensive suit clinging to a decaying torso. The face, bluish and sunken, featured eyes clouded with torment. Jack staggered back, nearly losing his balance. A horror-filled moment of recognition stabbed his chest. The wraith-like visage belonged to Harold Wicks, a former business partner Jack had bankrupted years ago, leading to Wicks' ruin and rumored suicide. But Harold had died. He was gone. Yet here he stood in the penthouse, chains rattling across the floor, a silent condemnation. Jack tried to speak, but his voice died in his throat. The spectre raised a trembling, skeletal arm, pointing with a crooked finger. Chains clanked. Finally, a hollow rasp emerged from the spirit. "You walk the path of greed. Your time ends soon." Shaking his head in denial, Jack stumbled backward. This can't be real." His breath came in shallow gasps. Harold's mouth twisted in a silent snarl. "Others will come," the spirit choked out. "Heed them, or join me in torment." With that, the figure's form dissolved into a swirl of black mist, leaving only the stench of decay. Jack dashed to the liquor cabinet, fumbling out a bottle of brandy. His hands shook as he poured a glass. He slugged the amber liquid, letting its burn chase away the numbness of shock. He insisted to himself it was exhaustion, stress, maybe a trick of his imagination. But a cold sweat clung to his skin, and the memory of that hollow face wouldn't fade. A sudden crash jolted him from his thoughts, pans clattering in the kitchen. Jack cursed under his breath and snatched up a marble bookend as a makeshift weapon. The tile floor was littered with upended cookware, spinning in circles as if flung by invisible hands. A fleeting shape skittered out of sight near the pantry door, short, agile, giving a mischievous giggle before darting around the corner. Brandy glass still in hand, Jack crept forward. The presents scurried into a rarely used guest bedroom, leaving a faint trail of footprints in the scattered flour from an overturned canister. Jack braced himself, heart hammering. He lunged after it, stepping into the bedroom. The door immediately slammed shut behind him. The lamp overhead flickered and died, plunging the room into near blackness. City lights from the window cast shifting patches of faint illumination on the floor. He called out, "Show yourself!" But regret knotted his gut. Why did he want to reply at all? A rasping laugh answered him from the shadows. Then a small, hunched figure slid into view, wearing a mockery of a holiday outfit. Ragged tatters of red cloth and a battered Santa hat perched on a skull-like head. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits. The creature clutched a warped photograph, a youthful Jack, maybe 8 or 9, standing beside a shabby but lovingly decorated Christmas tree. He looked so happy in that snapshot, the boy he'd been before greed poisoned his heart. With a cracked grin, the childlike phantom hissed, "Ghost of Christmas past." The photo crumbled in its hands, scattering spectral fragments that morphed into swirling illusions around the room. Jack found himself bombarded by memories. A warm family dinner on Christmas Eve, carols sung without cynicism, a time he actually cared about something beyond profit. Gradually, those scenes darkened, flashing forward to teenage arrogance, the rejection of family values, the fixation on money, power, possessions. The illusions swirled faster, distorting into images of bitter lawsuits and celebratory champagne toasts over other people's misery. Jack dropped to his knees, pressing trembling hands over his eyes. "Stop!" he roared into the darkness. The illusions vanished, along with the ghostly child, leaving behind tattered scraps drifting to the floor. In a panic, Jack fled the room, but the penthouse layout seemed disjointed now, like a labyrinth of twisting corridors. Doors opened to bizarre tableaus, a rotting Christmas feast crawling with maggots, a vault overflowing with gold coins slicked in oily blood. He slammed each door shut, choking back his revulsion, searching desperately for the living room. He finally reached the main corridor as the clock on the wall chimed midnight. The knell reverberated through the penthouse, sending a freezing ripple along every surface. Before he could gather his wits, another presence emerged from the corridor's gloom. This figure loomed tall, draped in a torn green robe. A wreath of wilted holly ringed its head, and a smell of decay clung to it. Shadows flickered behind the spirit, phantoms of men, women, and children. Even in half-formed silhouettes, he recognized them as some of the people he'd displaced or underpaid. Their eyes were hollow, haunted. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," the robed figure boomed, voice echoing like thunder. Its staff, carved from twisted wood, pounded the floor. "Behold what you have wrought." The air turned glacial as the phantom employees closed in around him. They looked desperate, broken, gazing at him with yearning or anger. Some extended ghostly hands as though pleading for mercy. Their lips moved soundlessly, but the anguish on their faces spoke volumes. Jack stumbled backward. The staff pounded the floor again, and the apparitions collapsed into silent moaning. "Enough!" he yelled, voice cracking with fear. He shoved through them, an icy dread clamping down on his heart. He bolted down the corridor, eventually emerging back into the penthouse's sprawling living area. He was panting, sweat freezing on his brow. The city lights glistened outside the panoramic windows, indifferent to his terror. That was when the final presence took shape, a being draped in black rags, impossibly tall, hooded so that no face could be seen. Jack felt a soul-shaking dread as he recognized the ghost of Christmas yet to come. The temperature in the room plummeted another notch, a crystalline rime forming on the windows. The spirit raised a bony hand and pointed to the glass. A hidden force threw the window open. A blast of frigid wind and swirling snow invaded the penthouse. Jack staggered from the icy gust, and the robed shape glided toward him, silent but demanding. In the reflection of the glass, he saw a vast cemetery, an isolated headstone etched with his own name. The date of his death appeared alarmingly close. "No," he whispered, tears finally brimming. "I can change. Please, don't do this." The ghost remained mute, its shadow swirling. Without warning, it lunged. A single skeletal hand seized Jack's arm with an icy grip. He shrieked in raw terror. His feet slid on the frosty marble as he teetered at the threshold of the open window. Snow fell in a raging torrent outside. The city lights glittered far, far below. He pleaded one last time, but the ghost only gave him a slight push. The motion was effortless. Jack plunged from the penthouse, the wind roaring in his ears. The snowy night swallowed his screams. For a moment he saw the reflection of glass windows streaking by, each floor passing in a deadly blur. The final sensation was bone-crushing impact against the icy sidewalk below. When police arrived on Christmas morning, they found Jack Luxmore's body contorted on the pavement outside the penthouse, a fresh blanket of snow drifting over him. The building's staff and onlookers formed a hushed circle, shocked by the gruesome scene. No sign of a break-in, no known enemies with reason to kill him. By all appearances, it looked like suicide. Just another millionaire whose sins and secrets caught up to him on a lonely night. Upstairs, detectives discovered a curious puzzle. The penthouse windows stood wide open, letting in the drifting snow. A few footprints peppered the marble floor, bizarre patterns that seemed to freeze the surface. Some claim the staff heard faint chain rattles in the distance, but official reports mention only the broken glass, scattered debris, and overturned furniture. The coroner scrawled "suicide" on the file. With no contradictory evidence, the case closed. The media spun it as a tragedy, a prominent businessman, possibly weighed down by guilt or stress, leaping to his death on Christmas Eve. Few mourned him. His employees and tenants found it difficult to muster sympathy, given the heartbreak he'd caused. The building replaced the shattered window within days. Life in the city carried on. Still, rumors persist. Late at night, the doorman swears you can sometimes feel a vicious chill in the lobby, as though something more sinister than a simple tragedy took place. A security guard insists he once heard dragging chains echoing from an empty elevator shaft, and if you crane your neck skyward in the snowy hush of a December night, you might glimpse a fleeting silhouette drifting behind the penthouse glass, a shape that looks like a gaunt man in a fine suit, arms outstretched, eternally begging for the chance at a redemption that never came. But no one listens to ghost stories in the city that never sleeps, especially not at Christmas time. The official record states Jack Luxmore's death was self-inflicted, just another cautionary tale of greed corroding the soul, leading a man to choose the darkness over the dawn. Yet under swirling snow and neon lights, if you tune out the city's din, you might catch the faintest echoes of rattling chains above, reminding the world that sometimes the spirits of Christmas don't bring salvation. Sometimes they bring a reckoning, and it doesn't end with a warm holiday morning, but with a final plunge into the icy shadows below. Long ago, before carolers roamed the streets and bright lights adorned every window, there was a midwinter custom that struck fear in every household. Parents told their children, "Be diligent, be kind, keep your chores done, or Frau Percha will come." And come she would, wrapped in her ragged cloak of dark wool, face half hidden behind a veil of frost and shadow. They say her eyes shone like glassy beads, forever searching for idle souls. In one frosty valley village, a family huddled in a cramped stone cottage. The father was a woodsman, strong-armed and proud, but often lacking the foresight to provide well for his kin. The mother, with worry lines etched across her brow, did her best to keep the house in order. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, were expected to gather kindling, feed the goats, and help churn the cream. Yet young Lucas, the eldest boy, was notorious for shirking tasks. He would sneak off to fish in the frozen creek or track deer in the snowy forest when no one was watching. While his siblings toiled in the bitter cold, he'd hide away, daydreaming of adventures and ignoring the unfinished chores left in his wake. Christmas approached that year with biting winds and heavy snowfall. Folks whispered among themselves that Frau Percha's shadow had been seen drifting through the pine trees at dusk. Windows were shuttered at sundown. Even the bravest men refused to wander out after twilight. Each evening, villagers locked their doors and reminded their children to keep their wool socks mended and chores completed. But Lucas, headstrong and bored with daily tasks, scoffed at the warnings. He found the dark stories silly, something meant to spook young ones into obedience. As December 24th dawned, the family awoke to swirling snow piling up against their doors. The father went out early for more wood, shouldering an axe. The mother scrubbed the floorboards, determined to keep the house tidy. Meanwhile, Lucas paced about the small cottage. Boredom gnawed at him, so he snatched his coat and slipped out while nobody noticed. The frigid air stung his cheeks, yet he trudged into the forest, boots crunching through the crisp, glittering snow. Under the towering pines, time seemed to slow. Icicles dangled from branches, reflecting weak winter sunlight. Lucas should have been gathering wood or hauling water, but the hush of the woodland tempted him deeper. He saw fox tracks, a scattering of rabbit prints, and let his curiosity lead him along a winding path. His footprints soon vanished in fresh drifts, hiding his trail. Twilight fell quickly. Shadows deepened, elongated across the snowy ground. The distant call of a raven echoed through the hushed forest. Lucas realized he had wandered far, too far, and turned to hurry back, but there was no recognizable path behind him. Panic set in as darkness pooled under every tree, and the cold grew sharper with every breath. He forced himself to recall the direction he had come from, scanning the trees for any familiar shape. Night fell, deep and merciless, and a full moon rose, cold as a silver coin. Lucas began to see movement in the corner of his eye, fleeting shapes that flickered in the moonlight and then vanished. The wind whispered through the branches, forming words he could almost make out. Was it his imagination, or something else? He pressed on, hugging his thin coat around him. Then, between two ancient fir trees, he thought he saw a figure. Staring from the shadows was a tall, gaunt silhouette cloaked in dark rags. He couldn't make out a face, only the glint of moonlight reflecting off something pale. Eyes, perhaps. She, if it was indeed a woman, stood unmoving, her presence strangely silent. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He remembered the warnings. If you are lazy, if you neglect your duties, Frau Percha will find you. In a flash, the figure was gone. A swirl of snow dust rose in her place. Lucas's heart hammered as he stumbled through the drifts, hoping to outrun what he'd just seen. Clouds drifted over the moon, plunging the forest into near-complete blackness. Behind him came the faintest crunch of snow. He froze, too terrified to breathe. Slowly, he turned. She emerged again, a hunched shape gliding closer, veil fluttering in the icy breeze. A single skeletal hand stretched from beneath the cloak, the fingertips black with frost. He tried to run, but his feet felt rooted in the snow, as if the forest itself refused to let him escape. No chores completed, he heard a dry whisper echo around him. The voice was hollow yet tinged with the scorn of centuries. No diligence shown. An instinct kicked in and Lucas wrenched himself free of the snow. He lurched forward, stumbling in the dark. Branches slashed at his face, pine needles tangled in his hair. He didn't care which direction he went, only that he fled from the creature said to slit open the bellies of the lazy and fill them with straw or stones. At last, after what seemed hours, he tumbled into a clearing lit by the moon. In the center stood a lone fir tree, towering and ancient. He scrambled behind it to catch his breath plumed in white puffs, heart pounding like a drum. For a moment there was silence. Had he lost her? Perhaps Frau Percha was just a folk tale after all, or maybe she had let him go. Then came the sound of crunching snow once more. Slowly that shadow drifted forward into the clearing. As she stepped beneath the moon's glow, Lucas saw the lines on her withered face, the sharp angles of her cheeks. Her cloak was tattered, the edges dragging in the snow. He saw tiny flecks of ice in her hair, if it was hair at all. Something about her eyes, dark and unrelenting, conveyed the promise of punishment. Mercy, he stammered, voice cracking. I'll do my chores, I promise. There was no response in words, only a rasping noise, like a hiss of wind through dead leaves. Then she vanished again, leaving just a swirl of snow in her wake. Lucas realized he was alone. The hush of the forest was absolute, interrupted only by his ragged breathing. It took him until near dawn to find his way home by following the faint glow of lanterns through the drifting snow. When he finally stumbled into the cottage, the fire had died and his parents were huddled by faint embers. His siblings, bleary-eyed, rushed to help him inside. He collapsed, clothes soaked, feet numb from frostbite. His mother gasped, noticing blood on his coat. It wasn't his. Eerily, there was no wound to explain it. He didn't speak of what he'd seen that night, but something in his expression told his family that Frau Percha had marked him. From that day forward, Lucas changed. At sunrise, he gathered wood without complaint. He helped feed the goats and fix the thatched roof, whispering prayers under his breath. Each evening he would place a small offering by the hearth, pieces of bread or dried fruit, hoping it might appease the winter spirit who had spared him. The villagers noted his transformation, but Lucas never recounted the full tale. Each Christmas Eve he'd stay up late stoking the fire until the first light of dawn. Sometimes he'd glance out the window, half expecting to see a ragged shape drifting among the trees. When the wind howled, he'd tighten his grip on the hearth's poker, remembering the skeletal hand that had nearly claimed him. And so, each generation in that village learned to heed the cautionary story. Frau Percha was no mere legend to them. She walked their paths on icy nights, peered into their windows, and watched the flames of their small hearths. For if any among them chose idleness or cast aside their responsibilities, they might hear her voice in the rustle of the wind, demanding diligence, punishing neglect. And that is why, my friends, it's said that on the darkest nights of winter, you should always keep to your chores and treat others kindly, because Frau Percha may be watching from just beyond the glow of the campfire. Picture a windswept moor in the depths of a harsh December, where the sky is a yawning maw of darkness and the bitter wind howls like a grief-stricken banshee. In the midst of this frozen wilderness stands Blackwood Grange, an ancient estate whose silhouette looms against the faint glow of a dying moon. It is Christmas Eve, and you'd think the halls would be decked with garlands of holly and the warm glow of a Yule log. But at Blackwood Grange, the only glow is the flicker of lanterns pressed against dusty windows, reflecting an eeriness that shivers down your spine. I spent that night there out of morbid curiosity and a promise to an old friend. He'd inherited the crumbling manor from a distant relative who died under suspicious circumstances some years back. Legend said the estate was steeped in darkness, and no one who stayed at Blackwood Grange over the Christmas holidays ever came away the same. Some disappeared entirely. Others emerged with hair turned shock white, raving about dreadful apparitions and shrieking spectres. Rational minds dismissed it all as folklore, local nonsense. But I wanted to see for myself. The two of us arrived just before twilight. Snow clung to the twisted iron gates, which screeched in protest as we pushed them open. The drive up to the Grange was a skeletal corridor of leafless oaks bending inward, as though they conspired to keep intruders out, or keep something trapped inside. The house was enormous, jagged spires, ivy-choked walls, and shuttered windows that seemed to watch us approach with malignant interest. Through the main entrance, we stepped into a vast foyer draped in shadows. Dust motes danced in our lantern light, swirling through the stale air. No Christmas decorations greeted us, only silence thick as the grave. My friend, who had boasted of his courage hours earlier, seemed to wilt beneath the gloom. We discovered that the electricity had long since failed, so we relied on oil lamps and the occasional candle. Soon enough, we lit a meagre fire in the grand fireplace, its flames casting flickering shapes upon the wall. We huddled near it, the rest of the foyer drowned in darkness. I noticed a portrait above the mantel, a severe-looking man in Victorian attire, with cold eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I moved. The nameplate read Ambrose Blackwood, 1856 to 1912. Christmas wreaths or good cheer were nowhere in sight. Instead, an oppressive hush smothered every corner. It was said Ambrose had once thrown a lavish Christmas party at the Grange. Townsfolk whispered that the guests who attended never left, and their ghosts roamed the corridors each Christmas Eve, reliving the unspeakable terror that had befallen them. Nobody knew exactly what happened that night, but the stories were consistent in one detail. From the stroke of midnight on Christmas Eve until dawn, the Grange became a labyrinth of restless spirits, their wails echoing through the halls. Sitting by that feeble firelight, I recall the odd hush settling over my friend and me. It was as if the house exhaled a breath it had been holding for decades. We tried to exchange small talk, but every word felt hollow. By 10 o'clock, the cold had crept into our bones. The windows rattled with every gust of wind, and the old walls groaned as though shifting under a great weight. In the corridor beyond the foyer, floorboards popped and creaked, prompting me to shine my lantern into the gloom. Each time I did, I swore I saw shapes flickering just beyond the edge of light, like silhouettes retreating into the shadows before they could be fully revealed. At around 11, curiosity pushed us deeper into the manor. We wandered long hallways lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to track our steps. In one dusty sitting room, we found a broken Christmas ornament on the floor, like a fragile glass orb that had once sparkled with festive color. It was shattered, the pieces shaped like shards of ice, reflecting our lamplight. Why was it there? The silence in that room pressed on my ears, and a faint tapping sounded from the walls. Perhaps rats scurrying behind the plaster, I tried to tell myself, but it felt more deliberate than that. We emerged into a drawing room where a rotted Christmas tree stood, still decorated with antique tinsel. It must have been left there ages ago, entirely forgotten. The star on top was crooked, tarnished black, and the branches were dead sticks covered in dust. The sight made my stomach clench, a relic of a joyous holiday left to decay in a house that had no business hosting cheer. At 11:30, the temperature plummeted drastically. Our breath fogged the air, and even the flames of our lanterns burned weak and pale. In the flicker of light, I spotted footprints in the dust, a trail leading from the corner of the room toward the grand staircase at the far end of the foyer. The footprints looked fresh, as though made moments ago. My friend and I glanced at each other, tension twisting in our chests. Neither of us had walked that way, and we were clearly alone, weren't we? We followed the footprints, heartbeats thudding. My pulse hammered in my ears as I peered up the staircase. It spiraled into blackness, banisters carved with sinister motifs, gargoyles, twisted angels, and devilish shapes. Step by agonizing step, we ascended, lanterns trembling in our grip. About halfway up, I heard a whisper. Faint, breathy. It said a name, but I couldn't make it out. My friend froze, eyes wide. I saw his lips move. "Did you hear that?" he mouthed. I nodded, fear pulsing in my veins. At the top of the stairs, the footprints vanished. Before us stretched another corridor, lined with closed doors, each leading to guest rooms or abandoned studies. Then something moved at the far end, a flicker of white. I raised the lantern. In the dim radius of light, a figure stood, wearing what appeared to be an elegant Victorian gown, tattered and translucent. Her face was a pale oval, hollowed by despair. She slowly turned toward us, and her eyes were nothing but dark sockets. A wail, long and mournful, shivered through the corridor. My friend clapped a hand over his mouth to stifle a scream. The figure glided backward, disappearing through a wall, leaving us paralyzed. My heart pounded like a hammer against my ribs. Footsteps echoed again, from somewhere behind us now, as though something else roamed these halls. I spun around, shining the lantern in frantic arcs. Another door creaked open. We hurried forward, compelled by a mix of fear and dreadful curiosity. We stepped into a sprawling ballroom. The windows were draped with moth-eaten velvet curtains, the floor a sheet of dust. Yet as we entered, we heard faint music echoing from an unseen orchestra, distorted violins and a sorrowful piano tune, as if played from a distance. My friend dropped his lantern. In the gloom, shadows danced in jerky motions, half-formed shapes weaving in a long-forgotten waltz. The temperature dipped even further, and I could see my own breath swirling in the air. The apparitions, dozens of them, floated across the room, mimicking the steps of a grand party. But their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow. Every so often one would flicker into clarity. A man with a twisted grin, a woman missing half her face, another with a gaping wound in his side. All were locked in this haunted waltz of death. We staggered backward, bumping into each other. The music rose in a crescendo, a haunting melody that jangled my nerves. Suddenly, the dancers all turned, faces pointing our way. Their expressions, contorted by anguish or violent rage, froze my blood. One by one, they began drifting toward us, arms outstretched. Their tattered finery roiled around them as they came closer. Terror flared. My friend shrieked and tried to bolt. I grabbed his arm, but he broke free, sprinting for the door. Instantly, the ghosts rushed him. Their wails, amplified, echoed off the vaulted ceiling. I watched in horror as they converged upon him, and his screams sliced through the icy air. They swarmed around him, a swirl of shadows and pale faces, until he vanished amid the tangle of limbs. For a heartbeat, I stood petrified, every muscle locked in dread. Then self-preservation seized me, and I ran. I fled that ballroom, stumbling through the corridor. The ghostly wails followed me, echoes of a Christmas party trapped in torment. Over my shoulder, I glimpsed spectral forms slipping through the walls, rooms, ceilings, pursuing me. The entire house rang with the cacophony of tortured souls, as though every victim of that cursed Christmas long ago had awakened to reenact their final moments. Lungs burning, I made for the grand staircase, nearly pitching headfirst in my haste. Floorboards splintered under my weight, the wood rotted and treacherous. I crashed through one step, but desperation fueled me to yank my leg free. Behind me, the shrieks crescendoed. If they caught me, I was certain my fate would mirror my friends'. Dashing across the foyer, I saw the front doors, barred shut with heavy beams. When had they been sealed? The thick wooden planks looked centuries old, bound with iron chains. My mind reeled. Trapped in a house that thundered with ghostly revelry, screams of despair, twisted Christmas carols that floated from unseen throats. Up above, that rotted Christmas tree collapsed with a deafening crunch, as though unseen hands had toppled it in rage. The eyes in the portrait over the mantel burned with malevolent life. Ambrose Blackwood stared at me, lips curling into a grin that seemed to say, "You are mine." My only escape route was a side door that led into the manor's courtyard. I sprinted for it, the thunder of phantom footsteps at my heels. My trembling hands fumbled with the latch, but mercifully, it gave. I burst outside into the howling winter gale. The yard was an overgrown ruin of dead hedges and half-toppled statues. I followed the muddy footprints I'd left upon arrival earlier, ignoring the biting cold that stabbed my lungs. As I scrambled away from the house, I dared one glance back. Through the snow, I saw shapes pressed against the windows. Ghostly faces, some shrieking in silent rage, others weeping black tears, their hands clawing the glass. The ballroom windows pulsed with flickering light, as though an infernal party raged inside. Then the entire vision vanished behind a swell of wind-driven snow. Somehow I made it through the gates. The snow battered me, the wind roaring in my ears, but I kept running until I reached the village road. Dawn found me half frozen outside a neighbor's cottage, stumbling onto their porch, rambling about apparitions and horrors. By the time the sun rose on Christmas morning, I was trembling under a borrowed blanket, telling a disbelieving local doctor about the nightmare I'd survived. The authorities searched Blackwood Grange later that day. They found no sign of my friend or any living soul, just echoes of footprints in the dust and unsettling cold spots scattered throughout the halls. The rotted Christmas tree in the drawing room had collapsed, the battered star lying among the decay. Beyond that, the house was empty, silent. But the neighbors swore they heard faint strains of phantom music at nightfall, drifting through the bitter air. I don't know if the ghosts of Blackwood Grange only haunt on Christmas Eve, or if they roam year-round, but I'll never forget the sight of those decaying revelers dancing their cursed waltz beneath the rotted rafters. Something hateful, twisted, and hungry lives there, an echo of a party that ended in terror, an eternal Christmas nightmare. And if you value your sanity, you'll heed my warning. Never set foot in that monstrous manor come Yuletide, because once you feel those icy hands reaching for you, once you hear the wail of condemned souls crying out for deliverance, you'll know that the spirit of Christmas can also be a spirit of eternal, unrelenting horror. That's my warning, shared here around the safety of this little campfire. The next time you see a grand old house looming in the snowy gloom, with dark windows reflecting your curiosity, remember the fate of Blackwood Grange. Some Christmas ghosts don't come to teach a lesson or deliver a gentle message. Some come to drag you into their unending waltz of torment, to keep you dancing in the dark halls forevermore. Daniel had never felt more alone during the holidays. At 20 years old, he'd left his small hometown for college in the big city, but struggles with money and failed classes had forced him back home. He felt like an outsider in his parents' house, painfully aware that he was a disappointment in their eyes. Christmas Eve found him working a late shift at a seedy discount store, miles from any bustling malls or twinkling holiday lights. The lot outside was a stretch of frosted asphalt, illuminated only by a handful of flickering lamps that cast weak yellow halos through the driving snow. He clocked out just after midnight, nearly the last soul in the building besides his half-asleep manager. The old fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead as he headed to the exit, the hum fading only when the automatic doors slid shut behind him. The wind outside was savage, turning the parking lot into a swirl of snow and faint shadows. Overhead, lamps winked out unpredictably, leaving pockets of near darkness. He spotted his car all the way at the far end, a battered sedan nearly buried in fresh powder. Daniel tugged the hood of his jacket tight against the sting of the storm, his breath clouding the air. He was tired in every sense, tired of obligations he couldn't meet, of family tension, and the creeping sense of failure. For months, a cynicism about God and faith had hardened in his chest. He remembered the wide-eyed boy he used to be, who once stood proudly next to his parents in church, singing carols about the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, after a string of disappointments, Christmas seemed hollow, an echo of a faith he wasn't sure he believed anymore. As he trudged across the snow-laden asphalt, he realized how still the night had become. No traffic noise, no holiday chatter, just the hiss of wind that scattered flurries across the lot. Then he noticed something standing beneath a lone lamppost near his car. The figure was tall, motionless, draped in what might have been a pale, fluttering garment. Daniel couldn't make out a face, only that the lamppost's weak glow revealed the barest outline of strange, wing-like shapes extending from the figure's back. His pulse quickened. He took a few careful steps forward. The figure made no move, no sound, yet it seemed oddly luminous. Snow fell steadily, swirling in and out of the lamppost light. For a moment, a wave of empathy and fear flooded him. What if this was someone injured, a wanderer in the storm? But something about the stillness, the unnatural clarity of that outline, felt more eerie than any stranded traveler could. He paused, heart pounding. "Hello?" The wind snatched away his voice, and the figure didn't respond. Overhead, the lamppost flickered, casting the parking lot in near darkness for half a breath. When it flared back on, he caught a clearer glimpse. The wings, if that's what they were, had a faint shimmer like ice crystals. The figure's face, or the space where the face should be, looked more like a blank expanse or a mask of pale light. A chill unrelated to the storm coursed through Daniel. Something ancient and unsettling pulsed in the air around him, pressing on his lungs, making it hard to breathe. He hesitated, torn between fleeing and stepping closer. Curiosity nudged him forward, while dread tugged him back. Finally, he forced himself to approach. Drawing within a few yards, he saw the figure shift slightly, tilting what might have been its head in his direction. Daniel's blood roared in his ears. The presence emanating from the figure was almost overpowering, beautiful and menacing all at once. He remembered Old Testament stories about divine beings whose mere appearance brought prophets to their knees. For the first time in ages, he felt an odd stirring of reverence, or maybe just abject terror. The lamppost flickered again, and the figure's outline blurred in the falling snow. Daniel thought he glimpsed moving patterns across the shimmering wings, as if they were etched with delicate shapes that pulsed faintly. His knees weakened. Trying to speak, he managed only a whisper. "Do you need help?" The figure remained silent, but in the hush that followed, Daniel felt something stir inside his mind. Fragments of images, church pews on Christmas Day, his mother lighting Advent candles, the story of Jesus Christ's birth he'd once known so well, recounted in the Gospel of Luke, the manger, the star, the hope it symbolized. The memory struck him like a jolt of electricity, flooding him with equal parts longing and shame. A sudden wind gust kicked up the snow, and for a split second, the entire lamppost stuttered. In the ensuing darkness, Daniel thought the figure had moved closer. His heart pounded, panic churned in his stomach, but an even stronger emotion rose, a recognition that he stood on holy ground. Fear contended with awe, and a tear froze at the corner of his eye. This was no random stranger. Whatever it was, it transcended his skeptical worldview. All at once the lamppost flared. The creature's wings spread wide, capturing the light in a prismatic glow. The force of its presence knocked Daniel backward onto the snow, breath snatched from his lungs. He tried to shield his face with one arm but was transfixed, pinned by the weight of those impossible wings. He remembered the ancient accounts of angels, divine messengers blazing with power, and realized that this was neither gentle nor comforting. It was raw, majestic, terrifying. Just as quickly as it happened, the lamppost flickered out. Darkness swallowed the figure, leaving Daniel shaking on the ground. When the bulb finally spluttered back on, the being was gone, as if it had never been, but the intangible weight it left behind hung in the air. Daniel scrambled to his feet, heart pounding like a drum. He rushed to his car, fumbling his keys, nearly sobbing with a mix of fear and a strange, uneasy elation. He drove home in a daze, the storm gentler now, his mind replaying the event in loops. Was it all real? At times he nearly convinced himself it was a hallucination, but something in him knew better. The memory of that luminous presence lingered in the corners of his vision. He recalled the fleeting images of a stable, shepherds, a star overhead, a child's memory of Christ's birth that he'd long dismissed. He realized the simple story of Christmas might hold a truth more powerful and more frightening than he'd ever imagined. By the time he pulled into his parents' driveway, the snow had settled into a quiet drift. Lights in the living room window glowed softly, illuminating the Christmas tree they'd decorated a few days earlier. Daniel entered the house, heart still racing, and crept into the living room. The star at the top of the tree shimmered gently in the half-dark, an emblem of all he'd once believed, that a star guided wise men to a newborn savior. He stood there, breath unsteady, the sting of tears forming behind his eyes. He reached out a trembling hand, fingertips brushing one of the branches. Then his gaze lifted to the star perched at the top. He remembered how, as a little boy, he'd perched on his father's shoulders to place that very star every Christmas. The story of Jesus' birth felt closer now, urgent and alive. The raw wonder of what he'd seen in the parking lot pressed in on him, mingling with the memory of an infant king in a manger. A single tear traced down Daniel's cheek. He let it fall. The hush of the house enveloped him, broken only by the faint hum of the heater. Maybe he wasn't certain of everything yet. Maybe questions still roiled inside him. But in that moment, standing before the softly glowing tree, he felt the faint pulse of hope. The birth of Jesus Christ, once just an old lesson, suddenly felt vital and profound, in a way no sermon had ever conveyed. He closed his eyes, the warmth of that memory and the star's gentle light intertwining in his heart, and in that quiet place he allowed himself to believe that something miraculous, or at least meaningful, had touched him on a cold, snowy Christmas Eve. And so, dear friends, as the flames of our fire begin to dim and the stories of the evening come to a close, let us remember what Christmas truly means. It's a season of light in the darkest nights, a time of hope, faith, and wonder. Whether you find it in the warmth of family, the glow of candlelight, or a quiet moment beneath the falling snow, Christmas reminds us of the beauty that still exists in this world. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Char TV, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. From my cozy corner to yours, I wish you all a very Merry Christmas, filled with joy, warmth, and a touch of magic. Thank you for joining me tonight, and may the season's spirit stay with you long after the night fades. Good night and God bless.